We're going to get started. So I'm Diana Petty. I'm from the Mansueto Institute for Urban Innovation. Thank you all for joining us for this conversation about spatial equity, housing, and bridging research and practice in this realm. This event is hosted by the Kreisman Initiative on Housing Law and Policy, which is a partnership between the Mansueto Institute, the Law School, Office of Civic Engagement, and UChicago Grad. A special thank you to the International House Global Voices Program for co-sponsoring this event. The Kreisman Initiative's goal is to build a community of scholars interested in housing issues and to create educational opportunities for training the next generation of housing researchers and practitioners. So that's why we're all here tonight. We are incredibly grateful to our panelists for lending their expertise to this discussion. And they truly represent a really unique blend of the housing field, hailing from research, policy, community development internationally and locally, and also place-based analysis. I'm honored to introduce them to you, if only too briefly, to do their incredible work justice. Anni Beukes is a resident fellow at the Mansueto Institute. She comes to us from Slum Dwellers International, which creates networks of community organizations to empower the urban poor in over 32 countries. At the Mansueto, Anni is leading the Million Neighborhoods Initiative, which aims to bring the power of mapping and spatial data analysis to help neighborhoods around the world be healthy, vibrant, and connected. Thank you for being here, Anni. Juan Linares is the executive director of LUCHA, a Chicago-based affordable housing development agency, which offers housing counseling, foreclosure prevention, and legal assistance to 8,000 clients annually. LUCHA also partners with residents, community organizations, financial institutions, and government agencies to maintain $34 million in real estate assets and to advocate for greater affordable housing options. He's also a graduate of the Booth School and adjunct faculty at the Law School. Nicole Marwell is an associate professor at UChicago's School of Social Service Administration. Her research examines urban governance with a focus on the diverse intersections between nonprofit organizations, government bureaucracies, and politics. She is currently working on a project exploring spatial inequality in government contracting to nonprofit organizations in New York City. Marisa Novara is a vice president at the Metropolitan Planning Council, where she directs MPC's housing and community development work. This includes managing technical assistance and support to communities facing challenges related to housing, transit-oriented development, and economic development. She also led MPC's recently released Cost of Segregation report and ongoing work, which quantifies Chicago's annual losses in income, lives, and potential due to segregation. I'm finally obliged to mention that she received one of her master's degrees from SSA. And moderating tonight's discussion is Yana Kachoris-Ori, Director of Strategy and Academic Partnerships at the Office of Civic Engagement, and also a Harris graduate. She is responsible for the strategic direction of OCE's programs and facilitating urban research collaborations with UChicago faculty and civic partners. Prior to joining OCE, Yana worked at the MacArthur Foundation, leading multi-year housing investment initiatives for the philanthropy, so she has significant subject matter expertise there as well. With that, I will turn it over to Yana to get us started, and thank you all again for being here.
Thanks, Diana. Can you guys hear me? Is mic on? Okay, great. Well, welcome everyone. Good evening. I really do actually feel like we're having a fireside chat. I feel like I need these chairs in my living room. These are quite nice. So we're really glad you're here for this conversation this evening. I think this is a really important topic, not just because it's something that I have focused on in my career, but because this is just an issue that I think people are talking about in Chicago and globally. And so we have some of the best experts here to have this conversation. So welcome, everyone. So to start, I'd like to ask our panel to consider, and everyone here to consider this definition of equity from PolicyLink. This conversation is really about spatial equity, and so I wanted to start with a definition of what we mean by equity. And PolicyLink provides a really, I think, good and succinct definition of what equity is. So here it is. Equity is just and fair inclusion into a society in which all can participate, prosper, and reach their full potential. So what I'm going to ask each of our panelists to do is to tell us a little bit about themselves, their organization and their work, and how this concept of equity and spatial equity in particular shows up in their work, and how they might define spatial equity in particular. And then focus on how the role of housing, what is the role of housing in achieving spatial equity? So Annie, why don't we start with you?
Thank you so much, Jan. It's on? Everyone can hear me? Thank you, Jana. Thank you, everyone, for coming. And yeah, it's my great pleasure to be here with you all and share some of our thoughts or my thoughts around the subject. So as Diana mentioned, I come to the Mansueto Institute from Slum Dwellers International, where I worked for about 4 years along with communities on the ground in Africa and Asia to map their neighborhoods, mostly slum neighborhoods. So many of these neighborhoods are not acknowledged on maps, and SDI has, for the past 30 years, now facilitated communities to come together in federations and organize both around savings, building savings networks in their neighborhoods, but also predominantly to map. And this is also where I met our director at the Mansueto, Luis Betancourt, Jose Lobo, and some other scientists and technologists, and our aim really was to, for one, the need for SDI was to digitize all this knowledge, this data that they had, so that this knowledge also becomes available to third parties outside of the organization. So for many years, SDI has used this information to advocate and to dialogue with city governments for improvement in slums, both around housing, but also security of tenure and improvement of services. So as Diana said, at the Mansueto, I'm together with Luis and many others, and we're hoping more will join us, working on an initiative we're calling the Million Neighborhoods Initiative. So through our work these past 5 years or so, we've come to realize that the depth of knowledge and the capacity of local communities to increasingly not just generate this knowledge, but also share it with others is becoming ubiquitous. So almost when we started 5 years ago, hardly any of the slums that we're working in were mapped. When we look at OpenStreetMap today, we see that almost every house, every building is mapped. And so the big question is what next? And that, so when I think about spatial equity, coming from the spaces in which I've worked, neighborhoods is where it's at. And for me, a neighborhood is a place where people come, where they live, where they work, where they play, where they dream. And so when I think about spatial equity, I really think that this is what I would want neighborhoods to be these places that connect both publicly but also private spaces in a way that give people a sense and experience of having a good life or the opportunity for a good life. So I'm a big fan of Jane Jacobs, you might know, and I really love her. So I'm also really a big fan of the idea of streets and sidewalks and their sidewalks and what they do as public spaces in neighborhoods. So for me, for one, they connect neighborhoods to themselves internally, but they also connect neighborhoods to the city. And so in my work, and especially in mapping, and where we're looking at the next phase of our work, is really to see how do neighborhood streets and sidewalks, how do they become part of the integrated public space of the neighborhood, but also how do they connect in terms of housing, residential security for everyone who lives there. That's an aggregate of the cost of living, access to basic services, but also social, technical, and political access to the city and to their neighbors.
Great, thank you. Juan Carlos, do you want to go next?
Yeah, thank you for asking me to be here. When I was asked to come and have a conversation about spatial equity, I thought 2 reasons why I should come. Number one, I don't even know what spatial equity is, right? So how am I going to learn about this with my fellow panelists? But as we discussed it, you know, we're all working on this in a way, and we'll have that discussion today. Also, I live right down the block, so I have no reason to say no. It's an easy walk, and it was really great to come back to this facility. We just love coming here with the international programming they have. So that said, I'm the executive director of LUCHA. LUCHA's mission is to advance housing as a human right, and I'll talk about that history now. Later in the day, we'll talk about you know, how you can get involved, for those of you who are students, not necessarily with LUCHA per se, but in your careers and how that evolves, and kind of how my trajectory was to get to LUCHA. All that said, LUCHA started as an organizing body of Puerto Ricans in the Humboldt Park, Westtown, and Logan Square communities. I was born in Humboldt Park. I was raised in Bellwood. And so I kind of knew about the issues growing up in terms of redlining and arson for profit. Who knows what redlining is? Okay, half of you, right? So redlining is a practice that I would say from the 1930s through the 1960s until the 1968 Fair Housing Act, one can argue even today, where lending institutions were not lending to communities of color by law, because there was a thing called the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which is now Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae, which are the secondary mortgage industry, which said that we're not going to lend to communities of color, largely African American communities, but also other ethnic communities. So I mention that because when we talk about spatial equity, there's the unit of analysis, right? So we work at LUCHA in terms of the individual and the household unit of analysis. And they are largely Puerto Rican, Mexican American, and also African American. My background is, I'm not Puerto Rican, though I work in a Puerto Rican organization and community. My father's from Guatemala. My mother's from Peru. My wife's family's from Mexico, so I think in our own household we got the Americas covered, right? And I grew up in an African American community. And there's a lot of similarities in how equity plays out in terms of household equity, health equity, energy equity, right? And in the aggregate spatial equity. Let me conclude by saying that the things we work on now then, we started as an organizing body. We have since morphed and evolved to become an affordable housing development agency and a housing counseling agency. So there's legal services involved in that. There's HUD certified counseling services. Derek, one of my friends and colleagues here with Northside CDC, does this work as well. And then also what we call resident services, because we can't expect to do affordable housing development and just plot buildings down, and I'll talk about how that works later, but then and move people in, particularly in this instance today, Puerto Rican evacuees, and just think everything's going to be okay, right? People need support in their lives as well. So when we're thinking about these issues of spatial equity, what I'll be talking about is how we activate that on the ground.
Great, thanks. Marisa?
Sure. I would, in order to get into the spatial equity question, I actually want to start with SSA. Diana mentioned that I went to school there, and my second year internship at SSA was in the West Side neighborhood of North Lawndale. That ended up becoming my job, and my husband and I ended up buying a house there and living there for about 12 years. And I worked there for 10 years, the last of which was doing affordable housing development. And I say that to say, I think it is part of my thinking, that shapes my thinking around how we think about spatial equity in a way that is, I think, a little different, having left 10 years in Lawndale to now being at an organization that is regional in scope. And so I'm thinking about, over the past year, so our city the city of Chicago does 5-year housing plans, and this 2019 is the start of a new 5-year period. So last year was a planning year for the new plan. And as part of the work that I've been doing at Metropolitan Planning Council, we were in some conversations with the city around what if in the planning of this new 5-year housing plan, we incorporated a racial equity framework, and we analyzed kind of where we are today and where we should go forward through a racial equity lens. And one of the comments, this was actually not someone from the city, but someone else who was in this conversation, one of the comments that we heard was, well, I don't even know what you mean by that. I mean, most of the affordable housing we do is on the south and west sides. Isn't that racial equity? And I want to interrogate that a little bit, right? Because from the standpoint of historically disinvested and redlined and contract sales and all of those things, from that perspective, absolutely, we need to be, equity means we are targeting more resources to places and people who have had less, right? So in one sense, I get that. The other sense, though, is a real conflict I have with the notion that if you need a subsidy in order to live affordably, that you can only do that on the south and west side of the city. And if that's true, then who gets to decide that? Who decided that? Who said that that's the range of options that people get to have? So when I think about spatial equity, a really important principle to me is that as a city, I think it's a pretty basic tenet that we say all communities need to contribute to the city's affordable housing needs. You don't get to opt out. And there are people if we have a range of choices, there are lots of people who will choose to live on the south and west side. That is their home, and that's where they want to continue to invest and move up the economic ladder. I just think that shouldn't be the only place where you can live affordably in this city. And we need to do some work, and that's part of the work I do, to make sure that we are opening up everywhere as options to live affordably. And right now, instead, what we see is a process where people locally can say, I don't think that's something we need to do here. I don't like tall buildings, or I like our kind of semi-suburban feel of our neighborhood, or no Cabrini Green in Jefferson Park, right? That was a big one over the last couple of years. So how do we put the structures in place to say, no, that's actually not how we're going to function as a city? And we can talk more about that in future questions.
Great, thank you. Nicole?
Hi. So I just want to pick up on something that Marisa started talking about, which is this question of what is the role of government in contributing to and building the structures for coming out with spatial equity in housing as well as in other kinds of government investments. And so, my work, I think, includes housing issues, particularly given the important role of housing as a sort of home base for people, and their ability to thrive really depends, I think, first and foremost on having a stable place to live. But beyond that, the state, the government, at the city level, at the state level, the county level, the federal level, could, invest an enormous amount of resources in a lot of human services, things like job training, childcare, services for the elderly, language classes, a whole range of human services which are really designed to improve people's ability to grow and thrive and live fulfilling and lives that contribute to their communities. And so the question that I'm really interested in my research is looking at these government investments in human services of different kinds at different jurisdictional levels of government, and asking where did those investments actually land in the geography of the city? And it's an interesting, I think, corollary to the point that Marisa raised, which is, where do you want to put those investments? Do you want them concentrated in communities of higher need, where it might be easier for people to access those services if they need them? Do you want them spread out more broadly across the city to imagine some kind of greater equity in that sense? And right now, the reality is that we don't really have a good sense even of where those investments are. And that's particularly true if you try and understand the investments across the different governmental levels and across different departments within governments at the city or the state or the federal level. One of the things that I've been working on a lot is trying to understand the data that is available to see where these investments are actually going, and finding out that the data as it exists, created for operational purposes, really doesn't give us good leverage on this analytical question. And so one of the things that I'm really working on right now is trying to figure out, is there a way to actually give us a good big picture of where those investments are going and for what? And from there, once you have that understanding, it becomes possible to have a much more meaningful conversation about the questions of equity and how you understand it, how you conceive of equity, and how you can shift investments to achieve those kinds of goals. And from the government's perspective, I think that should be a critical goal that government is working towards.
Great, thank you. Well, I think we have a good introduction of how each of you are thinking about this work, and some good food for thought about how we kind of think about spatial equity throughout the course of our conversation. And I want to dig in a little bit more on this topic of research and what data and maps and everything can tell us for how we might address spatial equity. And so you each sort of talked about a different level or unit of analysis, to use your term, Juan Carlos, Annie with the neighborhood. Juan Carlos, you talked both about the individual and the neighborhood. Marisa, city region-wide, and Nicole thinking about all levels of government. So I'm wondering how you all, what role does the use of research, data, or mapping, what does that play in our work towards achieving racial equity? And so maybe, Nicole, if you want to dig a little deeper on what you just started sharing.
Yeah, sure. So we live in an interesting moment when it comes to data, right? Some days you look around and you think that just having better data is going to solve all our problems, right? It's the technocratic dream. If we just get enough data and the right data and analyze it with the right methods, we're going to be able to solve these problems that have been with us for a very, very long time. And while we might wish that that were true, I think the reality of it is that it really isn't, that we need to really have a strong combination of both understanding of the data, as in what's actually in these data that are out on the Chicago Open Data Portal, for example. If you pull down data on government contracting, what are you really getting? Because I can tell you from a lot of experience that you're not getting what you might think you're getting, right? And so you really need people who can understand what's in these data before you ever get to the point of trying to use these data to actually do analysis from which you can make decisions about something like how you invest to improve spatial equity, right? I think it's really important also to understand that there are all different kinds of data out there, right? Data is not only numbers. There's a lot of other kinds of data. Numbers get very privileged in these discussions because they seem completely commensurable. Everyone knows what a number is. Everyone knows which number is bigger and which number is smaller. It becomes a kind of language that is easy to comprehend. And yet there's, when you're talking about people's lives, you're talking about people's communities, you're talking about people's families, there are so many other data points that are not easily reduced to numerical values. And it's very important that as we think about data and as we use data for analysis, we cast a wide net in terms of the types of data that we find valid, the types of data that we find meaningful, and the way that we're able to put that data together, not only through quantitative analysis, but also through deep domain understanding by people who understand the lived experience and the work of people in communities.
Great, thank you. Lots of good threads to pull on later in the conversation as well. Annie?
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, sorry. I worked in slums for 5 years, so I'm not used to very formal discussions. So I'm used to sitting around in a circle and we all talk and we're on the same level. So yeah, and I think that that is such an important point that Nicole just made, and I think that is how I learned to work with data. I'm a community map maker. I sit around a piece of paper. We start drawing with the community. I take all my cues from them. We start drawing the boundaries of a settlement. We start drawing the services that are important to them. We start telling stories around what this map means, what everyone is drawing on this map, and so in my work, generating data or really co-producing data with communities is where I'm coming from. And I think that what Nicole also mentioned is that it is so important that there are so many different layers of data. So when I departed SDI, I was just telling Diana, because I am very much a quantitative person. I like to draw maps and have them very accurate. And what the communities, at the end, the slogan that they adopted for the data program was hard data, rich stories. And they gave me a hoodie with this printed on to remind me of the journey that we had walked together. And it is this conversation around the hard data that we can quantify, that we can communicate with everyone, but also the richness of mapping. And so in my research and in my work, I really work with maps, and we're trying to map not just infrastructure that is there and that is not there, infrastructure that is desired even. That's our next project, what we're trying to think, how do we vision and dream of communities, how do we connect them? And at the end of the day, the underlying thesis, I think, is that, as Luis has written a while back, we were talking about this today, is that cities are social networks. Neighborhoods are social networks, but they are held in space and in time. And it is how we think about this. And the underlying thing that really that I learned in SDI, but also what I tried to do in my research is that it's about in how spaces are connected, but also in how they complement each other in the city. That really works. And so all the the different data, the kinds of methods, the kinds of knowledge that we wish to produce with communities together, is bringing together both connecting it with the really smart work that academics and scientists and technologists are doing, but with the local knowledge of communities. And for us, is how do these things connect and complement each other, and how does that create a new kind of knowledge and information about cities and about neighborhoods that will help us to think about all the, what do we call those problems, vicious problems that people say about cities. And I mean, our approach is really, cities are not these problems, they're these opportunities. So in this co-production, collaborating together with each other, talking in the same, talking from the same map, say, that is for me in my research what I like to do and what I find a lot of joy in. Thanks.
Great, thanks. So it's sort of this shared understanding that comes from creating these maps in partnership with community.
Absolutely.
Juan Carlos?
Yeah, and I look forward to learning from your maps too, because we also use maps that are more locally based. When it comes to data, we come from the standpoint of data is integral to a project. It's a starting point for us. It's not an endpoint or an outcome itself, right? So we rely on the data that our friends put together and really work really hard with. But then we use that as a starting point. So one example, I see Dory Rand is here with the Woodstock Institute, friend and neighbor. So we use their data, and we have traditionally to look at foreclosure numbers in the region where they're at and compare that with lender data. And that's on the home buyer and foreclosure prevention side as a service agency. On the other hand, when it comes to renters, let me also say too, in terms of equity or inequity, when it comes to ownership, how many of you here own a home? I do. We get $139 billion worth of subsidy, or welfare, if you want to call it that, right, in the mortgage interest deduction. Renters, through HUD numbers, only get $35 billion in subsidies through all the different programs, some of which I'll talk about in a moment. So there's, renters get a quarter of the subsidies, or welfare, if you want to call it that homeowners do. And I would argue that we don't need it as much as some of the renters out there who are really, struggling to pay bills, to have, their health costs covered, education costs, and so forth.
Nor are we drug tested for it.
What's that?
I said, nor are we
great
drug
point.
tested
Great
for
point.
it.
It's an entitlement, isn't it, on your tax forms? So that said, let me give you a quick analysis on spatial equity as it relates to the renter household. So the 606 trail is an amenity that was constructed really quickly in 2013. It's something that the community had been fighting for, to get rid of a blighted elevated rail line that had just been sitting there for some time. By the way, another question. Who here is familiar with the 606 trail? Quite a few of you. I wouldn't call it the High Line of like New York in a sense. That's more of a walking architectural path. Closer to the Beltline in Atlanta, it's more of a walking, biking path. And so again, the community had wanted it for a long time. The communities I serve were largely Latino from the 1960s through, I would say, the last 10 years. And when this trail was built, we looked at the data, right? We worked with DePaul's Institute on Housing Studies to create maps and to see where housing prices were escalating. And what we found is on the west end of the trail, or I'll call it the beginning, because that's where we work, housing prices were going up about 140% from one 10-year period to the other. And so that meant that if you bought a home in 2000 at $200,000, you could theoretically flip it for $500,000 10 years later. But that's not what's happening. You still have folks who are selling their home for $210,000, $220,000. You have investors from outside of Chicago coming in, putting in $50,000 rehab, and then flipping them for $600,000, $700,000. So why is that a problem? So when I met with, one of the many times I met with Rahm Emanuel on this, he said, well, we want to see growth. We want to see, we want to see this happening, right? But the argument is we're actually losing people, because the housing stock that was going down were 2 flats to 4 flats, housing that's 2 units to 4 units, which is a quarter of the housing in Chicago and a quarter of the housing in the area that we're working. So when we see that, we're losing people demographically. The schools then, there's a multiplier effect. The schools lose children, and they get their funding on number of children enrolled. So there are interventions that we have to put in place. And briefly, here are 3. Number 1, more affordable housing. So we work under the low-income housing tax credit program. Show of hands, who's familiar with LIHTC? Good. Same number of folks. I think you're all in the housing industry on this side. I won't, it's a very complex IRS type of way to do public-private partnership of housing. I won't get into the mechanics of that, but know that we did get tax credits for that area, and we built 45 units of affordable housing, which is not, 45 units is small for an area of thousands of homes. Secondly, we looked at the health equity. We created our own data, and we said, as I started with, okay, we're putting people into these homes, but we're seeing other issues. They're not able to pay their rent. What are the major issues? It's health. We learned that there's asthma and diabetes, particularly in the children, that are affecting household rents. So we intervened with the hospital systems and the way we built the buildings as well, a standard called Indoor Air Quality Plus. And then we shared that knowledge with people around the country to say, hey, every time you do an affordable housing development, you should also have a health action plan attached to it. It's less than 1% of the cost of the whole development. And then lastly, energy equity. We saw that our families were paying lots of money in heat and electricity costs. So in short, we took a risk ourselves as a mid-sized nonprofit to pay for one of the buildings being the first multifamily passive house certified building in Illinois. In short, it's a building that's so well sealed, there's no heat or air mechanicals in the building. It's just always 68 to 72 degrees because it's a thicker insulation, the ventilation system is different, and there's some other components in the building as well. And that's technology that came from Germany. In short, our goal then is to expand all these practices. Instead of being just one model in the work we're doing, is to expand that citywide. There's no reason why we had to pay $300,000 extra marginal cost for that one building, other than we're the only ones asking for that equipment because the Chicago Code does not even allow us to build that building. We had to go 3 times to the Department of Buildings to get that in, just so our tenants could save 95% in energy costs and save the carbon footprint to that extent as well. So when we talk spatial equity, we try to combine all these things, but it starts with the data.
Great, thanks. Great, very practical examples of how the data turns into action.
One from my end, how many people here are familiar with the practice of aldermanic prerogative? Okay, about half. So prerogative or aldermanic privilege. Yeah. Oh, that, yeah. So quickly, the city has 50 aldermen. The way we have traditionally set this up is that in exchange for support, largely unanimous support for the mayor's agenda, there is an incredible amount of power that is given at the local level to aldermen over zoning decisions. You may have heard about this in particular of late, where a very powerful alderman was trying to shake down a Burger King. And for 10 grand, like we've gotten some major movement on ethics reforms over 10 grand to a Burger King that didn't even happen. So it's amazing. Anyway, so what happens is the way that then works is we have basically 50 policy shops spread out around the city that are making land use decisions, right? So as a land use organization that I work at, that's not an ideal situation, right? And what it has done is that over time, when aldermen, either because they don't want affordable housing in their ward and or because people in their ward are demanding that they not approve affordable housing in their ward, then in fact they do not allow the project to move forward. And the practice of aldermanic prerogative means they can say no, and then the way it has worked in practice, it's not written down anywhere, but the way it's worked in practice is all other 49 aldermen go along with what the alderman is saying for his or her ward. So that's kind of the code. That is the way that it works. So in thinking, how do we even begin to address this issue? Side note, I think for me, it's coming from a place of community-based affordable housing development that I come from. It's a real conundrum to me to think about how do you think about the value of local control and local input when you have communities, you have community-based organizations like LUCHA that are doing an incredible job engaging with and organizing their community, who want to have a say then and shape what happens. And then you have places that are using that local power to do things that are exclusionary and racist. So how do you set up a policy that allows for one and limits the other, right? And it's something I've spent a lot of time on over the past year of like, how do you do this? So what we did, the way that we started was to say, well, let's figure out what the city looks like by number of affordable rental units, and let's start from there. So we mapped out across the city which wards have, we went from 2.5% and less, and then we went to gradations up to 10%. So which wards have less than 2.5% of all their rental units are affordable, then 2.5 to 5, and goes 5 to 7, and then which are over 10. And after over 10, you were just, that's what it was. We didn't do a gradation after that. The 10 is arbitrary, admittedly. It's based on a statewide law, the Affordable Housing Planning and Appeals Act, and so we just followed that precedent to say, so if you're over 10% affordable rental units, then we coded you in one way. And you can anyone take a guess which wards were all over 10%?
Areas that are highly minority-based housing.
The south and the west side plus uptown. So those were, so there's 21 wards that were over 10%. There were 11 wards that were under 2.5%. And those, and so we saw very clearly from the map that majority white and wealthier wards are not doing their fair share of affordable housing production. In fact, the median income in those wards was over $80,000, whereas the ones that were over 10% was half that, was at $40,000. And so using this visualization, then we worked together with an alderman to craft some legislation that tried to set up some distinctions between the places that were, producing affordable housing and those that were not. And I can talk more about that when we talk about how do you put this into action. But that's the way, and it's sort of hard to talk about this because I have a map I could show you, but it's on our website, so you can see it there.
Great. Well, these are all very practical examples of how using data and information can help advance conversations. And in addition to that, the ability to sort of address these inequities, spatially or otherwise, really kind of, to me, come down to a few key issues. One is control of resources to this point of homeownership versus rental, tenure, the political power, who's at the table making decisions, and whose voices are in, as you were talking about, the data and the storytelling that are there. And I want to ask you each to reflect a little bit on how your work in housing addresses these imbalances as well, in order to be able to address spatial inequities. So in other words, where does your work come to ground in policy and practice? I think, Marisa, you started with some examples there, and Juan Carlos as well, but just getting a little bit deeper into the practice, policy, advocacy side. Juan Carlos, do you want to start?
Yeah, and I'll also give a shout out to Marisa's study, the cost of segregation study that was done a few years back, and then its follow-up that showed the way forward, which is another study and a series of data that we looked at in terms of segregation costs us money, right? It actually, even if you don't buy the moral argument against segregation, it also costs us money. That said, so I talked about some of the physical approaches, building buildings and that sort of thing, but there is also a policy piece to it. In the last several months, I've been quoting the ancient Chinese philosopher Mencius. You're familiar? This is the University of Chicago. You're familiar with Mencius, I think. And what Mencius said was, water flows downward towards the path of least resistance. And what he was saying really was that our human nature flows to the good. So we have a good human nature. And that goes to the mission of our organization and the people who work at nonprofit. We want to do good, but that by itself is not enough, right? So then we compare that then to the markets and to policy. And I think the comparable phrase to that is markets flow where policy drives it, right? And so as Marisa was saying, or a lot of what she was alluding to is that in terms of control of resources, at least here in Chicago, it is very localized in terms of housing, right, and the work that we do. Forgive me if I'm wrong, but I think the statistic is 35 aldermen or women have gone to jail in the last 42 years, something like that, and it's going to be like
73.
since 73, right? And it'll be like 2 more in the next, because they're both indicted now. There's 2 indicted now. So that's one way that, it's a constraint. It's a constraint on the policy that we're going for. It's a constraint on the resource allocation and how equitable that is. So for some of us in the nonprofit world, then, it becomes difficult with just the affordable housing development by itself to be a solution. So what we did was we partnered with groups like Logan Square Neighborhood Association, which is an organizing body, and other groups to put forward our own policy and ordinance. It's called the 606 Preservation Ordinance. And in short, I mentioned that one of the issues was the tear downs of 2 flats to 4 flats. So what we thought, this is what I call an in-the-box solution, because there's already a solution kind of there for us. There's already a permit fee for demolishing a building in the city of Chicago. I think it's $11 a square foot. I forget what the actual dollar amount is. But what we said is, fine, around the west end or beginning, if you will, of the 606 trail, in a pilot area about a square mile, you can demolish all the buildings you want, but you will pay to a trust fund $250,000 per unit, up to $600,000 for a multifamily building. So what we're saying is we're not stopping, and this goes counter to Ron Manuel's statements to us, was we're not stopping growth. You can destroy whatever you want and then build it up again. You just have to pay into a trust fund. Trust funds already exist. I'm on the board of one called the Chicago Low Income Housing Trust Fund, as appointed by the mayor. And in terms of equity and profit, it's a redefinition of what profit is, right? Is profit what goes in our individual pockets when you flip a home and you sell it? Or is it that money that goes into the trust fund that goes to repair seniors' homes who are on fixed incomes, or to replace affordable units that lifts the entire community up in their quality of living? So it's a redefinition of profit for us, right? So when you talk about policy and spatial equity, it's a challenge. I would say, here's the last piece too, community engagement. So, I mean, this is a very empirically rigorous school. I know, I went here too, I teach here, but at the end of the day, your voice matters. So we had to mobilize hundreds of people, particularly the young, to actually go to the alderman's office and say, okay, we have the data, we have the policy, now you need to take the lead on this and introduce this for us. We got it introduced into city council a couple years ago, but through political shenanigans, and this is where city council is masterful, they introduced their own ordinance, which is a solution that solves very little. I won't go into the details, just know that there's another pilot ordinance that was actually passed. But there's an election every 4 years, so we're hopeful that our policies pass in the future.
Great. Well, as representing the Office of Civic Engagement, the nod towards community engagement is an important one. So thank you for raising that. Marisa, do you want to say more about the work that you're doing?
Sure. Yeah, just to pick back up on how that got actualized, right? So I was talking about the way that we mapped that data. What we then did was to work with an alderman to introduce an ordinance that then actualized this. So what we set out was if your ward has more than 10% of its rental units as affordable, then you proceed as you always have. And in some ways, this is a nod to the fact that, and I had a Southside alderman tell me, you know what, I feel like I'm doing my share. When are these other wards going to pony up here? So in a way, and this was also a nod toward some political support of saying, like, we're recognizing the wards that are doing that, you continue as is. If you're under 10% and you get a deal proposed to you that has affordable units, you're now functioning in a different process than you were before. The way the process worked before is, I thought you were going to say, Juan Carlos, that your bill got sent to rules, which is where all good bills go to die. But the way that this often works is a proposal to, let's say, the zoning committee to just put this development on hold indefinitely, right? And that'll happen sort of underground, and the relevant alderman would say to the zoning chair, just hold this, don't call it. And over time, of course, the developer's just going to drop the project, because why would you keep banging your head against the wall, right? And this has been well documented. Last year, Maya Dukmasova at the Reader had a great series of pieces on how this came down in Napolitano's ward. So what we put in place was, if you're under 10%, you can no longer reject or indefinitely delay a project for non-fact-based reasons. I already went through what many of the non-fact-based reasons are that we hear in many of these hearings. So what that means is we put a time limit on when something's introduced. It has to be ruled on within 90 days. If it is rejected, it goes automatically to appeal to the Zoning Board of Appeals, where it has to be, you either overrule the objection. If you sustain it, though, you have to be able to prove with fact-based reasons why. It cannot simply be because my people don't want it, which is what we've had typically heard. And so it was this bill was introduced in July. It had 27 sponsors, which was about 26 more than we thought we might have, given it's kind of a radioactive topic. It has been. I think this is one that has shifted really dramatically in the past year. And again, it's gotten even more so with this latest indictment. So thank goodness for wiretaps, right? And just now, like in several mayoral forums that I've been to, one of the litmus test questions to candidates has been, would you enact limits to aldermanic prerogative when it comes to affordable housing? And the one I went to, you were sitting right behind me. Yeah, all down the row, everyone said yes, yes, yes. I mean, shocking. Like a year ago, no one was even asking about aldermanic prerogative, right? So this is sort of, in my world, the progression of how we try to move these things through. We start with data, we try to visualize, we try to move through policy and legislation. That doesn't always work, as Juan Carlos said. Sometimes you gotta, and in fact, our bill is still sitting in committee. It was went to the Committee on Housing and Real Estate. For a variety of reasons, we decided to leave it there and revisit with the new council, likely, not till this summer, given a likely runoff and so on. Another thing, which I won't go into detail on, that we're working on, though, is coming up with new sources of affordable housing dollars. The city puts very, very, very little of its own money into affordable housing. The vast majority of it is passed through from federal. And we would like to see that change. We've worked with several groups, Chicago Coalition for the Homeless, Center for Tax and Budget Accountability, on establishing a graduated real estate transfer tax, and the additional dollars from that all going to affordable housing. So that's another thing that we're working on, and had worked very closely with CTBA on the data to make the case.
So I think I want to segue a little bit to Nicole on this, because I think your last point on resources and where resources are getting allocated go directly to your research, and how that has, particularly in New York City, where you've done more of this work, how has that advanced the ball on conversations in New York, and what insights have you gotten from that work?
Well, I think the first thing to recognize is that demand, certainly for affordable housing, far exceeds the supply of resources, and both the trust fund approach and this new graduated transfer tax are efforts to sort of increase the size of the pie, which I think is really important. But I actually had a question for both Marisa and, I don't know if I can do that, but I'm going to.
Please do.
And Juan Carlos. I'm familiar with the debate about, where are you locating affordable housing, but there's a piece that neither of you mentioned yet, which is differential cost for building affordable housing in different neighborhoods. Namely that to build affordable housing in the wealthier neighborhoods will cost more per unit, potentially. I don't know if that's actually true. It seems like it would be, just from land costs, right? And so how do you think about that issue? I understand the sort of moral imperative and the fairness and the equity issue around locating affordable housing across different neighborhoods. And that yet then you ask the question, well, will that mean fewer units? And is that what we want? So I was just curious as to what both of you thought about that.
Yeah, I think that is a really important question that's central to a lot of the debate. And it's true, the construction costs would not be different based on where in the city, but certainly land acquisition looks very different. The other thing that can be quite different, we haven't talked about housing choice vouchers, but when there's been decisions made, the city has raised the levels to which you can use a housing choice voucher and then drop them, and we're seeing some movements back up for certain populations and so on. with a fixed amount of money, when you allow for higher rents, then of course you will serve less families. And that's under the paradigm of, a fixed pie. And I think so right now we have 40,000 people on the waiting list for housing choice vouchers, right? Recently, they opened up, just last month, CHA opened up their site-based waiting lists, and there are more than 36 sites where the wait is more than 25 years, right? So the imperative to serve as many people as possible is there, and I understand it completely. I also think that we have to acknowledge, though, that none of our options are cheap. On the front end, we thought, boy, it'll be really cost-effective to set rent levels at levels that will help us serve as many people as possible. And it'll be cost effective to build public housing on the cheapest land. Of course, that was motivated by racism more than land prices, but it also was cheaper. And so on. And so we see a bunch of cost savings on the one hand to do that. But we also see that sets in motion a whole bunch of issues that are not cheap on the back end. Juan Carlos referenced our study, but there's lots of other data that talks about the challenges that come from that approach. And so what I come back to on this is we have to have a values-based conversation, and then we find the money. I know that sounds pie in the sky, but I also know that we're a city that, when it comes time every year to pay out millions in police misconduct settlements, I've never heard one person say, but our pension crisis, we can't possibly pay it. We just pay it. We find the money. And so looking at things like a new source of dollars and being willing to step out on politically to say, yeah, we're going to raise taxes, but guess what? It's only for 5% of people going into a real estate transaction. So we'll deal with that. And then we'll use that money to do some strategic things that align with our values. And that's what what I wrestle with there, and what I'm hopeful for in the next mayoral administration and city council.
And I'll be brief because I want to hear Anni's approach as well, in particular her international comparative approach that I'm learning about. So a couple things. Number one, so the development that I was talking about called Tierra Linda, which is 45 units, each of those units cost $385,000 per unit. That is unconscionable on the private market. You can't sell that unless it's in a high value area in terms of its real estate. So how do we even justify that, right? Well, I talked to Leadership Greater Chicago last week. We're both fellows. I think you were back there. There you go. And that same question was posed, right? And so my counter to that is, well, these units, because they're regulated, are some of the best units you'll ever see. And they're the prettiest on the block too, right? They have to be monitored, and there's compliance, and they're inspected on a regular basis. So the rehab on that 15 years from now, when that tax credit compliance comes up, is going to be so much cheaper than any home you might own over a 15-year period, unless it's a brand new construction. Secondly, from the international comparative approach, is I do a lot of travel and visit government agencies. I'll talk about another one later. But a few years back, I went to Singapore and visited their Housing Development Board. And what I learned there is 82% of Singaporeans live in public housing, but only 19% of Singaporeans are low income by their own measure. And so there's a value judgment there on how they represent their people and what they value, right? So they say, we're going to house you. And by the way, most people want to live in public housing. If you visit the Housing Development Board, I see somebody who's nodding their head, it looks like IKEA, right? It's very welcoming, right? You go to our Chicago Housing Authority, and we work with them, we like them, but it's like they don't even want to be there, right? You go to the Housing Development Board, and it's a very welcoming place. Somebody told me it looked like an airport terminal, like just a nice one. And you get to choose your models and that sort of thing. It's a very organized and funded and subsidized system. We come back here, we talked about the Section 8 subsidy that we have, low-income housing low-income housing tax credit. It's not enough to compare to what the need is, as you mentioned, right? The demand is so high, and I don't have the number, but the demand is so high. Actually, I do have the number. We need 118,000 more affordable units in the city of Chicago to meet the demand. In Singapore, as an example, it is subsidized so you can get to work and you can worry about your education and your health costs. So in a sense, the last thing I'll say, it's housing for us is closer to what our health system is, in a sense, where I might be conjecturing here because I'm not a health expert, but as an employer, we pay for health costs, right? We're responsible for that. Yeah, there's Medicare and there's Medicaid for certain subsets of the population. It's very expensive, but we're largely subsidizing, right, the hospital systems or the pharmaceutical industry, whether you think that's a good thing or a bad thing. In housing, it's very similar. We're relying on a lot of local resources, and it's really a private market. Right? We're not subsidizing housing to the extent that other places do. In, by the way, the wealthiest country by far in the world, to one of your points here. So it really comes down to a value judgment and how we pay for these things. I will also say, too, in terms of land values, yeah, it is more expensive in some places, and acquisition really is the differentiating feature. But that's where government, I think, my opinion, should be involved.
Thanks, Juan Carlos. I want to give Anni an opportunity to talk more about all of these concepts in the international context, but we're going to open it up for questions after that. So get your questions ready. Diana, you're going to come around with the microphone for folks. So Anni, do you want to tackle this question of how all of this work shows up in practice and the work that you do around advocacy and policy?
Thank you, Jana. Thank you. I think we need a couple of days to talk about these things, as usual. So yeah, I think very briefly from my side, I think that the STI federations have a slogan: nothing for us without us. And so predominantly the work has been around advocacy to get people to just realize that these communities are out there. And I think and also what the communities have demonstrated, and I think to pick up from Juan Carlos what you said, I mean, some of the research that STI has done with universities, but also with the communities, is something that they called of late the poverty penalty. And I think this is also, we can also call this the inequality or the inequity penalty. And this is really the aggregate cost of living for not just residents, but also for the city, of inequitable distribution of access to resources, basic services, affordable and just residential security. So I think this has been sort of at the core of their advocacy message globally, and how this has come to bear in international frameworks. STI and other grassroots organizations like WIGO, Wairo Commission have been part of the grassroots constituency within UN Habitat for the past, I think, since 2015, really, and a lot of advocacy workers to then bring not just the awareness of the plight of poor communities into the global development agenda, but also really constructively to put it on the agenda. And so when we looked at in 2016, when both the SDGs and the New Urban Agenda were launched to the world.
SDGs, do you want to just say what those are?
Oh, sorry. So now I'm on the other side, because all the other side of the conversation.
Right.
So the Sustainable Development Goals, of which there are, you all know much better than I, too many to think about. But there was really an opportunity for grassroots communities to be part of I mean, you all are lawyers, most of you know, to be part of the text, to say, and that not just, and one of the things that the STI community and other grassroots organizations really celebrated was, first of all, not just our vice president at the time, she kept on using this number 50, that 50 times the informal settlements are mentioned in the New Urban Agenda. I didn't count myself, so I don't know. But the core of that was not just the mention of informal settlements and slum neighborhoods within these global agendas, but also the need for both evidence-based development for these communities, so nothing for us, without us, and also their participation in not just the development of these programs, but also in the implementation of it. So that was a big win, big win in terms of just advocacy, but also really taking the conversation to the global level and saying that we are here to work together for our cities, not just to be, as many see, a challenge on cities, and that we are the ones who are, sucking up all the tax dollars of all the rich folks. So that is really, I think, in the sense of that, I think that the work that these communities are doing at the global level is to show not just advocate for the aggregate cost of living, really what this means for themselves and for cities, but also the aggregate opportunities that there are to work together and to think a little bit, people always say slums have a light touch. I don't know what that means. I'm still trying to understand what that means, but it's just like the incredible ingenuity and social organizational capacity that is present in neighborhoods. And I don't, like you said, there are different ways of celebrating, romanticizing, and also vilifying local power and local knowledge. But there is, like I said, there's a larger conversation just to have around this. And I think that it's just that if there's one takeaway, I think it's this. For me, it's this: how do we aggregate the good, like you said, rather than focusing on all the hard stuff.
Yeah, no, that's great.
Thank you.
It's really helpful to have, I think, both the international context and what's happening here in Chicago and other places in the United States, and just that not the ideas of how we address these inequities don't just come from the people who are in the policy levels thinking the big thoughts, but that you're having the voice of the people in the community, and that's where really innovation can come from. So I want to open it up to questions from the audience. I have lots more questions. If there aren't any, go right here.
Hi. With the exception of Juan Carlos' mention of land trusts, it seems like most of the conversation has been about affordable housing that's affordable for a while, but not permanent affordable housing. And I wondered if you could address the issue of how much of our future affordable housing development should be more permanent affordable housing, whether it's shared equity or land trusts or things of that nature.
Does anybody want to take that?
That's a good question. So you just mentioned the word land trust, right? So that is one mechanism to be used to restrict a deed or restrict the value of the land moving forward. Actually, in the plug for the law school's Journal of Law and Policy, there's an article in there in the latest version that talks about Singapore, of all examples, and how from a purely market-based approach, restricting the value of land or giving it a certain time period of affordability over a longer period of time, they see in Singapore that it actually lowers the value of land. We see the opposite here, though. It's when somebody, I think it was you that mentioned Cabrini Green. We don't want Cabrini Green here, right? We have this history, and I talked about redlining earlier, about that practice of not loaning to communities of color in the past, which then created and exacerbated wealth inequality, which we see today, right? So the maps that you see from the 1930s in terms of racial and ethnic demographics kind of look the same today, right? And it started from that period. That said, then we went into a period, and for those of you who are urban planners in here, into this like radiant city kind of thinking where we wanted tall buildings, we cleared slums away. Hyde Park is a perfect example of this. How many of you are from out of state, by the way, or out of the country? A lot of you. Okay, Hyde Park is a really good model here for urban clearing. A lot of the buildings you see here are relatively new from the 60s, I would say, right, and moving forward, even though this is a very old community. And so when we talk about the new buildings then and the way we do affordable housing, and it's a defined term, capital A, affordable housing, our approach is, and we work with the Chicago Housing Authority on this, is we want to create aesthetically beautiful buildings that are also have the full participation of the people that live in them, which in a sense makes them special, right? But in my eyes, more educated to being a good neighbor, to being a good community resident, to being a good citizen. To get to your question though on how do we create long-term affordability, land trust is the thing, right? Now, in terms of Chicago and where we're at. But I'll go back to like Singapore's approach. Government has to be in the game. Government has the lead in this. And right now we have a private approach where it's both private developers who are responsible for affordable housing through the Affordable Requirements Ordinance. In Chicago, we have an inclusive, it's called an inclusionary zoning, thank you, where if you build a building of 10 units or more, 10% of those units have to be affordable. And by the way, I'll give you a measurement too. Affordable there's a chart for this that comes from the Department of Housing and Urban Development called the AMI chart of area median income, thank you. In Chicago, the area median income for a family of 4, the median is $80,000, which is way higher than it used to be, by the way, just even a couple years ago. So we serve people at 50% of the area median income, which is a family of 4 at $40,000. Now, if you think about that, if you work on minimum wage at Home Depot or McDonald's or Walgreens, like a lot of our tenants do, minimum wage now is $13 an hour in Illinois. What is that, $20-some thousand, $22,000, let me say, I'm just gonna guess, right? You can't even afford a LUCHA apartment, right? So when we talk about long-term affordability, it is in addition to the land itself and stabilizing that value, it's also looking at the different bandwidths of people and their incomes. There's an external factor here, an external variable, or an exogenous variable, if you will, that we haven't talked about. It's people's incomes, wages and incomes today, right? The inequality gap is so huge right now that even when we're talking about the work LUCHA does, I think we do great work and we do a lot of good affordable housing work, but even that cuts out people that are 30% or below of their area median income. I know that didn't fully answer your question, but I kind of want to throw a lot of concepts out there.
If I could jump in too, I think one of the constraints, and Nicole, I'll come back to you, is what are the policy tools that we currently have, and that they're not sufficient to beyond public housing, which has waned in investment. The low-income housing tax credit program, which is the primary subsidy that's available to create new affordable housing, only requires affordability for 15 years. So every 15 years, we're kind of going back to those developments to say, okay, how can we recapitalize and re-up that affordability? And so the tools that we have are limited. So I think there is a reimagination that we need to have about housing policy in this country, not just at the local level in terms of what the land use policy tools that we have, but also what are the financing tools that we have, which we haven't even got to. And I know you know a lot about those. So, Nicole, did you want to jump in on this?
I was going to say what you said.
Oh, okay, great. Sorry, didn't mean to steal your thunder. Annie, do you want to say something?
If I could, on affordable housing, because I lived in South Africa for 10 years, 3.3 million affordable housing units built by the government. Affordable housing for me in a long term means sustainable and equitable neighborhoods. It is the entire lifespan of a person that needs to be thought of. And it's not just about poor communities. It's about all of us. I think that we really have to, I think if even millennials can't afford houses. So I think that once we start thinking about neighborhoods as the unit, or neighborhoods as the space in cities that in terms of having a public space, equitable public space and open public space and I'm not talking about parks and benches. I'm talking about streets, their connectivity to public transport. What does it mean for a person to be able to afford where you live when you want to live there? I think that this has come up in the desire. I think, Marisa, you've mentioned this as well. It's just like through our entire lifespan, as we as human beings dream and live about these things. I think that for me, the long-term affordable housing really comes down to how do we rethink our cities and our neighborhoods and how they are connected and how they afford opportunity to people across their lifespan and not just around for 15 years and the next 10 years of their life. I think that for me is really the question around long-term affordable housing for all of us, not just those we would deem at the bottom quartiles, as we called it in STI, the bottom 40% or whatever you call it here. Yeah?
Mm-hmm. Any other questions?
Hi, I'm a neighborhood resident, grew up here, and I saw Woodlawn burn. You mentioned arson earlier. I used to go to fires growing up. So no one's mentioned, well, parks, you mentioned it very briefly. So I'm on 5 park advisory councils. And when a home is near a park, that home is worth 10 to 20, even 30% more. Mm-hmm. I don't see much advocacy across the city for the building of affordable housing near parks, mm-hmm. which will also make those homes more desirable once they're built for sale or even before. Mm-hmm. And the city obviously has not done enough on affordable housing. Has the MPC identified neighborhoods that both need affordable housing and new parks? Because there are a lot of neighborhoods across the 77 neighborhoods that we have that still don't have enough park space.
Our work around open space I'd say has been focused in different ways. For instance, we've had a multi-year project that looks at the land around the Chicago River, specifically not downtown, but all of the rest of the riverfront that is, makes up, I don't know, I think it's like 4 times the mileage that our lakefront does, right? And how do we take advantage of that with the potential for public open space and open access without engendering the kind of results that Juan Carlos talked about with the 606, right?
Or what Sterling Bay currently wants.
I think it's a really, really important question. People who are in spaces that have been disinvested want nice things too. They just want to be able to stay there once those nice things come, right? And we're working, this is not what you asked me, but I'll just say it anyway. We're working on a tool, the Community Impact Assessment tool, that in order to work proactively with communities, so you can imagine it in Pilsen with the Paseo, you could imagine it in Woodlawn with the Obama Presidential Center, to say, okay, we know XYZ is coming down the pike. We're going to look specifically at data that's specific to your trends and your home ownership rates versus rental and permanent affordable housing, et cetera. Look at all your data, look at your trends, and let's work together to see what are the most likely impacts, positive and negative, of this investment, and how do we proactively engage in advocating for what you need now. So imagine just last summer, the city came out with funds, right, for long-time low-income homeowners around the 606, right, to try to help enable them to stay. What if they'd done that 2 years before the trail even came online, right? Because you proactively planned for people want amenities and they want to be able to stick around to use them. So I went way left with your question, but that's some of the ways that we engage in that issue.
If I can add something to that, thank you for mentioning the different programs as well. That this has become a national discussion, right? So Marisa and her colleagues and us at LUCHA and others, through a collaboration called Elevated Chicago, have really gone around the country to talk about this. Yeah. The 606 being a model, not in a good way necessarily, right? On how we work with Atlanta and their belt line, or Los Angeles and the extension of their train line, right? So transportation, I would include transportation along with parks in terms of amenities that come to communities. So all that said, let's look at the amenity itself. Right? So in my thinking, and I've heard this even at this institution, is are we creating inclusionary amenities or exclusive amenities? So it's the difference between putting up a basketball court or a golf course, right? And what kind of values are we putting forward in a community when we think about the type of amenities we want to put in there? 606 is a great example because my vision of what the 606 would have been is not actually what's there now. If you go up there now, well, maybe not today because it's cold, but in the spring, winter, summer, or fall, there are quite a few people there using it. And again, the Latino people that used to live there, and by the way, Logan Square lost 19,000 Latino individuals from 2000 to 2010. I'm sure it'll be more numbers in the 2020 census. But part of the reason isn't necessarily the 606 itself, because it's the commensurate increase in housing prices around there, but it's also a result of who uses the trail. Right? So the trail, and I see you on your bike too, by the way, in the neighborhood. You see me with my kids, right? And we ride around slowly around the community. The people on the trail are folks that, and not to generalize, but it's folks that are flying down the trail. On your left, it's the young millennial, and they're also welcome in the community, but then the trail is really built for them. And so you start attracting people from around the country to live in these communities. And again, they're welcome in the community, but the issue is, are we displacing the people that have been there for a long time?
And you have the trail that potentially could happen in Inglewood, and what's going to happen to that?
The Paseo and the Inglewood Trail as well. So we're learning lessons. I think our job in part at LUCHA is not only to intervene with our own trail, the 606 trail, but to share those lessons with our friends on the south and the southwest sides.
Annie, I'm wondering if there's any international examples that you can think of around park space and this sort of intersection of housing. Okay, if not, but given your definition of neighborhood and spaces and the ways that people connect in those spaces, I'm wondering how you think about parks in that context.
So I was, Luis and I were talking about this earlier, but if I'm hoping there's one thing that people will, Sorry. You can see I'm very excited about that. So I think if I was, we were talking about this earlier today, and I think if there's one thing I really want people to remember when I say today, it's around like, when we talk about public space and people, first of all, they think about parks, they think about green spaces, really. I mean, and this is coming back to Jane Jacobs. I mean, this is, she said, about 50% of public space in a city, if we think about built environment, streets and sidewalks. And when we go into communities that I've walked in, which now actually talking about this, because it said when you look at these communities, you think they're not connected, they're not, and everyone says we have to bring in a park, we have to bring in a space, but once you walk in there and you leave the sort of first row, you see really this protection that people have around having some kind of open space within the community, so accesses that people walk in, but there are courtyards, there are spaces where children are doing homework outside. And this is something that is very, very protected around in the community. So when I was in another life, when I was an intern at Stellenbosch Municipality, we also had this, for the informal settlement upgrading program, everybody said we want a park. And the community said, you know what parks become? They become spaces for people to smoke ganja, marijuana, as you call it in this country. So I think it is this example, I think that you mentioned, and you as well, is like, how is it that we have this, we've gotten this built environment idea of what a public space is, but the public spaces that are the one public space that is in cities where we contact, where we meet people, where we see people. You and I have talked about this, that make us feel safe. That's almost the last thing that we think about. We don't think about streets anymore. We think about roads, but we don't think about how these are public spaces. And I've seen this in slums, that it's one of the first spaces that people are really protected about, are these informal public spaces. It's not the park that they want. So yeah, that's my one example.
Great. Thank you. Any final questions from, got one here and one there, and then I think we'll have to wrap up, right, Diana?
It has been said that the map is not the territory. So in the process of creating the map, what can we do to enrich the data by giving content and context to that mapping process? I know that most of the data is culled from a research question or questions, but as you're going through the data, as you indicated, you might be very surprised with the quality of the data that you have, the source of the data, and you are probably faced with impediments to try and verify the data, the source of the data. So a question for all of you, is there any technique or methodology that you can think of to recommend to enrich that data?
Well, that's a really big question, given that there are so many different kinds of data. I think actually a lot of the new data that people are really drawing on, especially technologists and people who are doing open, a lot of the newer spatial analytics and these kinds of things, a lot of those data actually were not created to answer research questions, and that's what the problem with them is, right? A lot of these data, for example, I refer to them as operational data that cities and other jurisdictions in government produce in the course of doing their regular business. So they do building inspections. Used to be they wrote those down on paper and put them in a file somewhere. Now they're all in a database and they come out on the open data portal, right? Building inspections, health inspections, lead paint inspections, bus routings, whatever it might be. All these new data that are out there and that technologists are, grabbing out of the cloud and running analyses on them without really understanding any of the context of how those data have been produced. So I think I don't have a specific answer to how can you fix the data, but the general prescription I would have is you have to understand the process by which these data were produced, which is what's going to help you understand what's in them and what isn't in them, and therefore what types of questions you can use them to answer and what kinds of questions you can't. And one major solution to that issue is to sort of merge and join a lot of different data and try and fill in the different holes that way. And that's, a strategy, but again, the same problem exists, which is you have to understand the process through which those data were produced, and therefore what's in them and what isn't, and what you can then draw conclusions on, because especially if you're trying to make decisions using these data and saying, well, but it's data, it must be right. People just really need to respect the knowledge of people who really do understand that, and not imagine that a technologist who understands very little about the data production process can just sort of whiz bang. I don't know if everyone's ever gotten an email from me. I have an XKCD comic on the bottom. The first panel is something like, "I'm here to solve your problem with algorithms." Second panel is 6 months later, go by. Third panel is, wow, this is a really hard problem, right? So that's just sort of a cautionary tale.
If I can add very briefly to your question, or to the response as well, is I think it's really important, being the non-data expert, I read the data, right? And then the next step then is interpreting that data or being able to narrate it to an audience that wouldn't necessarily be able to pick it up. I think Marisa and her shop do a fantastic job of that. And I know I visited with you the Urban Institute, and there's all kinds of data sets and very rich, analytics all over the place. But if those of us on the ground can't understand it, we don't know how to activate it, right? So I think there's got to be that connection. Secondly, I talked about combining affordable housing with health equity, with energy equity, but really all that came from the first study I looked at when I came to LUCHA in 2013 was an ethnographic study. So it's also combining the numbers with the narrative, with the on-the-ground individual experience, the lived experience. That becomes really powerful because once we learn from, for example, Jesse Mumm, you might know Jesse Mumm, he's a white guy who wrote a paper called When the White People Come. And it's about gentrification of his neighborhood, Humboldt Park and Logan Square. I think he teaches at DePaul now. But is an ethnographic study for his thesis that shared all of these lived experience issues of health and energy that we didn't see data sets for in the first place, right? So I just to add to that, it's important to see the rich data, but it's also important to connect it to a narrative and the lived experience.
Mm-hmm. This goes back to Annie, your point on hard data and rich stories.
If I can share my recipe, or like what we tried. So it took us about 5 years, but what we did, we took some really smart people from Santa Fe Institute, Luis Betancourt amongst them. Like, these are theoretical physicists, people who are thinking of complex studies, the major computational power. We took some technologists, really smart people who were writing AIs and algorithms and building these tools, and we took them to slums. And we took them and we sat them down with communities, and we said to them, okay, fine, so you guys are complaining that our data is not good enough for you to do your work. We're complaining that you're not hearing us. And so we did this for 4 years, every 6 weeks. In the first 2 years, we were together, sitting in slums, everyone together on the floor, and worked not just on the tool for our database. I only have experience in building one database, but designing the tool together, designing the processes, the methodologies around how we would collect data, making sure that it's not just when we're going to put our data in a computer, it should work when the computer is also offline, because we've got no access to internet. So we had technologists coming in and saying, oh, wow, we know how to do that. And yeah, that was our recipe. And I think that it is slow work, first of all, I think, and this is what we all have to acknowledge. And it is collaborative, and it is confrontational work in the same time. And I think that is what a lot of people don't have patience for. And I think that's what I learned in our.
If I could just add to that, just to sort of validate both what Juan Carlos and what Annie said, I'm an ethnographer. I'm not a technologist. I don't know how to run any, equations or whatever. But I'm interested in data because data is the basis for so much decision making these days. And so I'm interested in understanding what is going on with this data, where it comes from, what people think it does, what people actually do with it. And in the project that I'm working on, I've been working with data on contracts from government to nonprofit organizations for longer than I would care to remember, since before open data portals, when I had to FOIA for the data. And I've done it in New York for a long time. I'm doing it now in Chicago, and I've been doing essentially an ethnographic exploration of the data production process, and develop, with my colleague Julia Kaczynski, who's here at the Center for Spatial Data Science at Chicago. We've identified how the operational data that's done on contracting, right? Because the database gets produced because government has to pay its vendors, right? And when government pays its vendors, it creates a data trail. There's a bunch of fields. It's not the fields we want to be able to understand spatial equity in the distribution of contract money. But the good news is you don't actually have to do that much different to get the right fields. And if government would just shift a little bit, and we're working with an agency here in the city of Chicago that's actually doing this right now, shift a little bit the fields of data that they collect, you actually open up the possibility to do this kind of analysis. So it's this idea of moving from a simply operational data production process where you're only producing it as data exhaust to doing the city operation that you need to do, in our case, paying vendors, right? Shifting that a little bit so that you're able to say, gee, we're producing all this data exhaust. What else would we need to really improve the analytic capabilities of these data? And so it's a long process, just like Anni was saying. It's an ethnographic process, which I would say is not about telling rich stories. I mean, ethnographic data is good for that, but it's also good for figuring out what the problems are in data. And so that's where I'm coming from.
That's great. Well, I think we have one more. Do we have time for one more question? You're going to cut us off.
Unfortunately, I gotta call it. I'm so sorry, but the good news is there will be future Kreisman Initiative events to dig deeper into these kinds of issues, and also for students in particular to think about pathways for getting involved in this type of work. So sign up for email updates on the Mansueto Institute website if you have yet to do so. So with that, I would welcome you and invite you to give a big round of applause to our speakers and moderator. Thank you so very much.